But understand that what's going to occur is that you can't prepare yourself to manage your human trauma, because this is the first time you're clearing trauma ever in this way. And what you're doing is you're leaning into your spirit self. It isn't just going to heal you in this timeline or in this life. You actually begin to get access to this multidimensional version of you.
Welcome to the Multidimensional Soul Channel. Today I'll be speaking with Phillip, and he'll be sharing his personal story of his awakening. We'll also be discussing the relationship between clearing trauma and our spiritual development, as well as collapsing timelines, past lives, star seeds, and how to access future versions of ourselves. What first led you to exploring your spirituality?
I tripped into spirituality. It wasn't something that I had set out to explore. I started to have these experiences in my mid-40s where I woke up one morning and it was just a very normal morning. There was nothing overly special about it. But I woke up in the early hours of that morning and I noticed that I could see what looked like a person who appeared in a very misty type figure, but it looked like it was a young woman in her 30s and 40s. And it was just in that moment that I experienced sort of hearing her thoughts. Yeah, and it was at early hours of the morning. I got up and was a little bit frightened. And then as I got up, after about 2 or 3 minutes of communicating sort of telepathically, and it was all by accident, I realised that, okay, there must exist another world that is not necessarily visible. And I set out in the following months to try and understand what that particular experience was about.
So how did you make sense of all of that experience?
I worked out that there exists multiple experiences or multiple versions of ourselves that are not necessarily visible. And that took me probably 2 to 3 years to sort of unpack, because my development around my spirituality was very experiential. I realised early on that if I didn't honour my own sort of natural progress, where I understood that I was able to start to see and hear, things that were probably not within our normal visual spectrum. For example, like, spirit, or, seeing colours and geometric shapes. And I realised that if I just allowed myself daily to focus on sets of principles that I'd come across through my sort of spiritual development in the last few months, once I began to sort of wake up and see. So I got very focused, and I started to be aware that I had this other body, or other bodies that were non-physical, and that my ability to see and hear sort of in the non-visible world was being connected to this other energy system that existed. So I began to explore the notion that there is an energy system that is not physical or dense, that may sit on another vibration, another frequency. And in that exploration, sort of in the following months, I began to sort of interact with my spirit body. And at that point, I became aware of the chakras that sit within our human form. But our chakras are actually units of energy that are resonating at another frequency. And so it was a completely different world that I slowly adjusted to, or a completely different perspective of this world that I was existing in.
So from that first encounter with the woman, how did you then become aware that there were these other bodies that you existed as?
It was a feeling sensation that I experienced. So when I got up at 2-3 that morning, and I noticed to the left of me was this woman that was sitting in my room, I think what made me believe what I was experiencing immediately to be true was that particular woman had been in my dreams on at least 3 or 4 occasions throughout the course of my childhood development and then my early adult life. And so immediately my mind understood that although it felt like a random experience, that there actually wasn't random. that there was me being able to sort of reflect back helped me legitimize the experience I was having. So it was really about me trusting myself and that I had a point of reference to work with. I think if I didn't have a point of reference where that woman that had appeared previously in my dreams, if I didn't have that, then I could very well have began to experience self-doubt. And I think what became really apparent was that if I was able to trust that what came up or what I was being presented with had a purpose, it had a function, that the more I was going to be able to surrender and the more I was going to be able to access these, more intricate internal parts of self.
And the woman that came to you, did you recognize her? Was she a guide? Was she a loved one in spirit?
I didn't realize until afterwards that she was a guide. So she presented as an energy form. So it's almost like a holographic projection. Yep. But it was a holographic projection and it had a density to it. So not as dense as you and I in our corporeal form, where we exist as 3D matter. But there was a density to her that I could feel and I could see and hear, but not one that other people were able to sort of take note of. Yeah, so I trusted that experience. And a couple of weeks after, as I was continuing to explore what that meant, I really, through thought in my mind, I said that if these experiences require me to sort of continue to grow in a way that I'm not familiar with and that I really don't understand, then I'd like something additional in the non-visible world to sort of appear. And then 2 weeks after that, I had got confirmation at the edge of my bed, about 2 or 3 in the morning. There was this translucent blue figure. It's about 2 meters in length and probably about 1.5 meters in width. And again, it was a very etherical looking unit of energy. And it had no sort of human constructed traits or appearances. It was more this universal midnight blue sort of translucent energy. But the energy had a resonance to it where it was still able to communicate. It felt very graceful. It felt very divine. And I got up. I was really frightened and I could hear it telepathically communicate for me not to be fearful. So it was those 2 experiences within a 2-week period that really helped me ground into this other truth that was going to really guide me for the next 5 years around sort of the unfoldment of my spiritual development.
Would you say that there was anything going on in your life at the time that would have triggered this awakening experience?
Look, as I reflect back, I would say that it was an awakening. Yeah, there was a trigger. I experienced an inability to sort of navigate the grieving process. So I had a family member that passed away at the time, an immediate family member. And I think that I was having trouble processing grief. So I think that there was a relationship between there being a level of resistance in my body that was beyond sort of, shock and anger and even the trauma and loss of losing someone that you love. There was something inherently esoterical, something spiritual around the loss of this family member that really was a catalyst for this awakening, for these other aspects from the notion of self to begin to awaken. So yeah, the catalyst was the immediate loss of a family member. Yeah, and as I look back, I think that sometimes when we experience, potentially trauma or grief in our life, that in many ways it can be a catalyst to awaken or even shift sort of the energetical density that sits within our body. And somehow there seems to be a relationship between the shifting of that density, which carries a frequency, a unit of energy, with a shift within our emotional, sort of mental and even spiritual awareness.
And was there any challenges that came up around that for you? How did it affect your everyday life?
So in relation to consequences of me coming into another level of awareness, on a personal level, it meant that my version of reality up to the age of 45 years old, that somehow had to experience a death. And so from a very personal perspective, there was a death of me that was being undertaken as I awoken to this higher spiritual perspective of self. And inevitably what was going to occur that I didn't know at the time was that if I'm no longer being that previous version of me, that meant that the person that was married and that was a father or a son or a brother or a nephew, that version of me was also in change. And so the consequence of having an awakening, specifically my awakening, was that it resulted in all the relationships in my life becoming very different. And in some of them they ended, and in some aspects of other relationships they were maintained. But I definitely did change because, well, I had access to another version of me. And what was occurring was that version actually got brought forward. And so that was something quite profound that, I look back now and I still look back with a lot of gratitude.
So then how are you able to, moving forward, create new relationships as this new awakened version of yourself? Did that change as well?
So I think what is occurring that becomes a constant is initially when an awakening occurs in the first few years, other than our own private development around self-awareness, what ends up occurring is, of course, we're the total sum of our life experiences. That all needs to come up to be cleared. So for me, I was accessing another level of perception, really perspective, but it also meant that if I was going to now exist and oscillate on a higher frequency, that in essence, here I am, this unit of energy, this bandwidth of frequency that is just physical matter up until the point of me being 45 years old, that all my relationships up until that point, it's almost like a frequency radio tune, that I was being a match to that particular level of density that I had carried and I had been for 45 years. When I started to see and perceive my experience as a human being differently, it also meant that the energies or the life that I'd lived that had a particular frequency or a particular resonance to it, that was going to also be changed. And that meant all the traumas or all the struggles that I had experienced, that was beginning to shift, to become dislodged in this physical form. So over the last few years, a lot of that has come to the surface to be cleared.
Would you say it was like going through a dark night of the soul?
Yeah, I hear the term dark night of the soul quite often. So for me, I really had to, manage and begin to explore aspects of the shadow self. So it depends on a lot of modalities. So, there's lots of different teachers out there that will talk about, the shadow self, working with therapeutical models. But for me, what it was that initially, yes, it was the inner child work. It was, aspects of the self that I deny, whether they were feelings of hatred towards people or self. But what ended up occurring was, as I began to develop a little bit more over the last few years, I realized that what was occurring was there is a relationship between the clearing of trauma in your current form, as you come into your sort of awareness that there are these other versions of lived experiences from your soul perspective that you can now begin to get access to. So as I was coming into that truth, I also became aware that as I was clearing and dislodging the trauma of this lifetime, that I was actually, in actual fact, bringing forward more future versions of me. So versions of me that were more functional, other versions of me that recognized my patterns of behavior and managed to clear through them. But when I began to access more of my spiritual center, which meant I could develop more of my energy centers, my chakras, my energy body, when I was starting to develop those versions of Phillip having, a whole set of experiences that were spiritual, I realized that I was actually collapsing timelines. So I was beginning to collapse, the 45 years that Phillip lived as he was clearing trauma, that existence that he lived, in many ways, it began to be dissolved. So that version of Phillip was no longer real. There was no point of reference for him anymore. So this other version was really me inviting a future version of me to come forward now. And I realized that in actual fact what's occurring is that there is a collapse of timelines and an integration of other timelines.
You mentioned needing to clear out trauma. How did that process play out for you?
So it was presented in different stages. So initially I leaned heavily into developing my spiritual body. So I wanted to understand what chakras were, what the energy centers were. I wanted to know why I had this additional sight that I could see spirit or beings or even see auras. And so as a result of wanting to understand that better, I began to develop what is referred to as psychic and mediumship skills. And so as I began to develop that, it involved me outsourcing support and engaging teachers. And I did that, in different parts of the UK. I travelled to the US as well. And even in Australia, I began to engage teachers that were going to be able to support that development. So yes, I did get additional support, but also I went into therapy. I understood that I was going to be confronted, with trauma and issues that had not been quite resolved in this lifetime. And so I did both. I engaged additional support around my spiritual and mediumship development, and then got support for the experience, the human version of me that was also navigating this life. And that looked different throughout the last 5 years. So when I began to understand that, I would do a meditation and all of a sudden I would see that I could see a future version of me that was 20 or 30 years older, but it carried the same soul. I was in the same home. And so when I was doing these meditations, I could see another aspect of me be energetically present while my eyes were closed. And in those moments, and I had quite a few of them, in those moments I realized that if I'm experiencing this more spiritually developed aspect of me, and that version of me is coming forward, stepping, closer to me in this timeline, that the notion of, my past or my present or even the future, that all of that was negotiable in many ways. That if I managed to continue to develop spiritually, that I could, in actual fact, access these more developed versions of me, and through meditation, I would be able to draw them closer towards me. And I noticed that as that was occurring, my ability to clear through my trauma, my patterns and my behaviour in this lifetime increased exponentially, to the point where I, managed to address quite a lot of concerns. And for me, it was the previous version of Phillip no longer really exists, not in the way that I knew him or understood him to be. So that timeline collapses because without it collapsing, without there being sort of a reconciliation or a reintegration of the life that's been lived, I don't believe I'd be able to draw on more future version aspects of me.
So when you were having these experiences where you would see yourself like a future version of you, were you getting a sense that everything is happening all at once and then
Yes.
you could just drop into a different timeline? Is that what you mean by collapsing a timeline?
For me, what it meant was that if through meditation, here's this, and the only way I knew that it was a future version of me was because each of us all become familiar with the resonance of our soul. So when you begin to meditate, when you begin to become more centered in sort of a spiritually grounded space, there's a particular silence that you become familiar with. And that silence is really an opportunity for you to hear your soul, for you to feel your soul. And so over the years, I got to develop a relationship with understanding how my soul is feeling and what it feels like. And so I knew that I would not have access to this future version of me in a way that is informing me of who I am, who I've become, also where I came from in the future. I wouldn't be able to know that to be true if I wasn't also experiencing a clearing of this unit of energy that I knew to be Phillip. So you're correct, they work simultaneously. And in many ways, the more that I've developed spiritually over the last few years, and the more I've been able to access these other projections of my soul, the more I've understood that what we know as linear time in this human form, it's really just a construct to incorporate a point of reference. But from a soul perspective, the experiences that I had that were personal to me really helped me understand that if we can remove ourselves from a linear time point of reference, that we do get access to collapsing timelines, which are previous timelines. But this is also duplicated from a multidimensional perspective too. So further on, when those meditations give you access very much to the cosmos and sort of the cosmic multiverse, your ability to access, past, present, and future versions of you, it works on the same principle. But what's really sort of the common denominator is ensuring that you do have access to your soul, because that is, that's sort of the common denominator.
So if you were accessing future versions of yourself, were you also able to access past lives?
The past lives, interestingly, sort of the least difficult part of this development process. So past lives, for me anyhow, so for example, I live in this body, and my body, Philip's body, is the spirit of Philip in this current life. What ends up occurring is past lives are projected spirit versions that come from your unit of soul energy, and the projected spirit versions that is very much, for me anyhow, wanting to resolve and live out particular themes and patterns. And if we don't feel that we've managed to resolve patterns of behaviour or even clearing of past trauma, we'll endeavour to, I think by choice, revisit this sort of human experience until we can then reconcile, integrate the very exact things that we want, not to just learn, but to also heal. But what becomes very interesting, so there's this phenomena about star seeds or beings that have birthed into a human existence at this particular time in our earthly timeline. And so there's going to be a lot of spiritual beings, including myself, who have access to this level of awakening that I'm referring to in this discussion. And so when they access their past lives, they'll be able to remember if they also had levels of awakening in their previous lifetimes as well. So it's not necessarily about only clearing trauma and healing from whatever karmic relationship is yet to be integrated or resolved. There are many that also, when they access their past lives, they're able to draw on the awakenings that occurred in many other timelines. So for those that have those experiences, be aware that what's then occurring in this timeline is actually you coming into the remembrance of what you are and also who you are. So when you developmentally come into the experience where, as you're having your awakening, the experience very much feels like it's a remembrance, then what that suggests is that you're doing now exactly what you've done previously in many lives before. You're coming into a heightened sense of awareness because it has a very specific purpose. And it's a very interesting angle as well when people talk about past lives, because it's often referred to as people needing to clear and heal, what is still carried through and themed. But it also has a very multidimensional perspective to it if your soul is destined to access that level of awareness.
Just going off the feedback that we get from people who come to our workshops, who are gaining greater access to past, present and future versions of themselves, would you say there's anything special about the times we live in at the moment?
So something that is really important for people, I think, to be very much aware of is, primarily we exist as a unit of energy. And so, we're a part of, but also an extension of, what's really a level of universal consciousness. In this current time, the earth itself is awakening to its own level of consciousness. So in the same way I spoke about my spiritual awakening, the earth is coming to its own spiritual awakening. So it does exist as a conscious being. And what had happened thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, the earth did not have access to awaken spiritually in the way that I just described that I'm personally had my experience. But since 2012, for lots of reasons that I won't be able to sort of explain in the short amount of time that we have, what occurred was that there were many units of soul energy that decided we're going to birth into a human form. And as they birth into that human form, that they would specifically construct a life or a lifetime that will enable them to awaken to their spiritual self. And in that process, that they were going to alter this universal conscious stream that existed in our planetary body. As they were impacting this universal conscious stream, it was going to jolt like a wave. It was going to be an energy jolt to Mother Earth, to the Earth's consciousness. And so in that experience, the Earth began to have its own awakening. And she's referred to as the feminine. And so as she's awoken, in return, she changed sort of the sitting baseline unit of energy that we're a match to for so long. So as the Earth's consciousness changed and we continue to spiritually awake, there was this enormous shift in very much the frequency that Earth was emitting. So as the Earth now began to emit a higher frequency out into the cosmos, it meant that we were able to receive other multiverse and universal energies that could now permeate and come into our physical body, which is going to help with the awakening of many. But also it was going to bring up whatever density existed in humanity's timeline, that needed to come up to clear in the same way our human form carried density that needed to come up and clear. So what's very special about this particular time in humanity's history is that so many higher frequency individuals were able to navigate a human birth and collectively awaken, in that process enabling the shift of this planetary system to know itself as a conscious being. And this universal and collective sort of teamwork has been sort of predestined to occur in this current time. And that's why this time in humanity's history is incredibly important. This has occurred previously, but not successfully. So the goal of attempting to enable Earth's inhabitants to awaken to a level of consciousness has been in motion before, but not very successfully. So this is the first time, I think, in a very long time, that this universal shift is actually taking place.
And would you say that this is what people refer to when they say that we're moving into a 5D version of Earth?
To a degree, it can get a little bit complicated. The 5D Earth is really the internal 5D perspective. So what ends up occurring is, in the same way individuals come into their spiritual awakening, and they access different energy bodies, the 5D Earth is another version of what is really a higher level of consciousness. So you can access the 5D Earth from your physical form, but that's what a lot of people are referring to, that they want to prepare for the shift, that they want to prepare for their own ascension process. But their ascension process is really their internal awakening that will enable you to access this 5D version of Earth. Currently, the Earth is very much transitioning through a very dense 3D traumatic lived experience, and that's manifesting, it's quite visible, it's manifesting throughout the wars and the conflicts that exist. But, everything historically needs to come up to be cleared when we're looking at things from a trauma perspective, but also from the relationship to an individual's spiritual awakening in relation to trauma.
So would you say it's like a battle for our consciousness?
Yeah, it is, but the battle for consciousness is internal. So more often than not, you refer to the dark night of the souls. What ends up occurring is the spiritual unfoldment that we're all assigning ourselves to undertake is really about our desire, well, firstly, to ride the wave of ascension. So as the Earth's ascending, that will create a jolt in many of our energy bodies. And so there is actually a wave that will brush through this collective consciousness. But in that process, there's a requirement for us to unpack our trauma and our historical patterns of abuse that actually don't serve us. Only when we do that process simultaneously while surrendering sort of to our spiritual self, that is what's going to enable our awakening to our 5D self. And you also hear the term, there's a lot of faith-based beliefs around the return of Christ. My understanding is that the return is actually this consciousness return. And that when Christ embodied a human form, that embodiment was actually a fifth dimensional level of consciousness. And so I think the return of Christ, in my understanding, is that those that are awakening to an ascended earth, they're actually accessing an energy system that enables them to know the God self and access, in many ways, the Christ consciousness. And so that's less about a physical experience of Christ returning and more a metaphysical reunification of the Christ self. But that is very closely connected, to this ascending earth.
So would you say it's Earth's change in frequency that is allowing us to access higher states of consciousness? Or is it more that we are collectively raising our vibration, which is enabling Earth to move into the higher 5D frequencies?
It's both. So initially, in the 50s, the 60s and the 70s, those that birthed into this paradigm, this human experience, had lots of trauma and density to clear. And so a lot of the work was done in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s. And so a lot of the historical trauma that adults that are actually clearing is a lot of the density that they agreed to take on when they birthed into this time. So that shift enabled the earth to come into its awareness in preparation for this greater collective shift. And so there is a direct relationship between individual human beings clearing their trauma, but also coming into their spiritual awareness, and how that is altering the sitting frequency within this paradigm that has a direct relationship to the Earth's awakening. A lot of that's been occurring for quite a few years, over the last 10, 20 years. What's occurring specifically now in this timeline is the Earth is very much, the planetary body of the Earth is very much a family member of this solar system. And within the cosmic system, it's coming into its conscious awareness that, it exists within a larger body. In the same way, we're coming into our conscious awareness that our physical form, we're not just confined to that reality or that truth. So I think we're in a relationship where, as we continue to develop and grow, it will improve the health, but also the ascension process of the Earth.
So what would you say the greatest challenge for humanity is going to be moving forward?
As human beings continue to sort of unfold in their development, what they're going to find that they're going to experience quite a lot of is that there is still an inability to surrender and let go. And that although we're ascending and have been into a 3, 4 and 5D reality, and really a perspective of self and our place within not just earthly paradigm, but also our place as human beings with sort of this greater universal matrix, that unless we find the ability to surrender and trust, we're not going to, individually, not collectively, individually, we may not get to the place that we assigned ourselves to pre-birth. And so, at the moment, there is a lot of humanity that find themselves caught up into a really fear-based platform. And my support, well, my cry out to those that are listening is, you chose this timeline to be born in. You need to be accountable and take responsibility for what needs to be done to further your development. So you want to ascend with the Earth within a 5D platform, then do the work. Start to unpack your fears, your attachments. And when you do that, what is remarkable is the level of healing that you'll bring into sort of your platform or your forum of truth. It isn't just going to heal you in this timeline or in this life. You actually begin to get access to this multidimensional version of you. And that is truthfully what you want. So the 5D aspect of self isn't just this higher, insightful, more developed human self. It's actually your multidimensional self. So there's a lot of discussion around, the need to ascend with the Earth, but also and address your own progression. But what you're doing unknowingly, for some, is that you're actually attaining this greater holographic anatomy that is rich with development and growth and love and gratitude. And that's really, why you're remembering, why you're coming in to your development. It isn't just to ascend to the 5D version of you. It's to actually know that you're a multidimensional being. So in many ways, this is very much an introductory platform. So your 3, 4, 5D ascension, which is incredibly significant, is really just you shifting your baseline to know yourself within a multidimensional platform. And that's where the incredible level of development and work can be done as well. There is so much impending sort of drama and trauma, and we have to receive it and accept it with open arms and love.
Well, this is the work that you and I have been doing personally, and also with supporting the people who come to our workshops. So if someone was embarking on this journey of self-discovery, where would you suggest they start?
If you have a partial level of self-awareness, enough to know that your desire is to spiritually awake and you're not quite clear how to get there, or at least sort of direct yourself in a way that can at least put you in the correct trajectory. Set up a support structure, act as if, pretend until you get it right. And what that means is know that the trauma is going to come up to be cleared. Know that it's going to hit you and surprise you in ways that you haven't prepared yourself for it yet. But understand that what's going to occur is that you can't prepare yourself to manage your human trauma, because this is the first time you're clearing trauma ever in this way. And what you're doing is you're leaning into your spirit self. That's the aspect of you that's going to pull you through. So know that and trust it. But from a human perspective, set in an infrastructure, have a support team, see a therapist, talk about the things that matter, be truthful, don't lie. If you feel like you need to lie, then just withhold the information, don't lie. The challenges that you're going to face is your spiritual self is what's going to pull you through this human development, not your human self. Your human self is here for the ride, but you have to keep your vessel alive. You have to care for it, and you have to ensure that it can manage this process. Set in an infrastructure, get support, and, don't be lazy and sit back and just think it's all going to happen naturally because you're grounded and you're spiritually, have this desire. It is hard work, and you have to call yourself out. And, I spoke about timelines earlier. Timelines are in constant change. If you miss opportunities around your development, those opportunities won't come back, they're gone. What's going to be created are different ones. And in some cases, those different opportunities are going to be the exact thing you need. And in some cases, they won't. But look, as we finish up, one thing I just want to sort of finish on is we live in an energy system where everything exists within pattern formats. Your past lives coming back into now to be cleared is because there's still a pattern that you're a part of, energetical resonance. There's this geometric systems that you're involved in. So everything will be a pattern in a cycle. Look for them. Look for the patterns in your life. Have a look at the coincidences. They're the signals that are going to tell you that you're aligned. Yeah, it's just so important to know, to actually keep an eye out for those signposts.
Yes, I love that. As we close off this discussion, I'd just like to let everyone know that if you are interested in any of the workshops that Phillip and I run, you can visit our website, themultidimensionalsoul.com. See you next time.